we go. Okay. P H A N space capital B O I space capital C H Joe A U space Phan Bội Châu was W A S space. Oops, too many. Backspace. Okay, was a revolutionary. Okay, R Rev E the Shun S. Can't do it anymore. I just can't do it. Typing. It just takes so much coordination, you know? Oh. So I've been reading this book recently. It's one by Phan Bội Châu, the Vietnamese revolutionary who was prominent in the early 20th century, went to Japan, is famous for doing stuff like coming up with new ideas. And he's got this book called the Vietnamese History, the examination of Vietnamese history, which I feel like I have never read this before. Have I never read this before? Why have I never read this before? Maybe I have read this before and I forgot it? I have no idea. In any case, I was looking through it and I came across a lot of really interesting stuff. This is a fascinating book. Phan Bội Châu wrote this in like 1908 when he's in Japan and he's gotten all these new ideas from interacting with all these people like Chinese reformers and revolutionaries. And he's got a chapter in this book on Vietnamese history, which is different from earlier Vietnamese histories. It's not just a chronology of what happened. It's more like thematically based. And there's one chapter that he's got that is on heroes who have rejected foreigners and established independence in the past. And the thing that's really interesting about this is the term that he uses for reject foreign or foreigner. In Chinese, it's pai wai. In Vietnamese, it's bang wai, which is really interesting because that term doesn't, it has certain negative connotations. It means more than just reject foreigners. It means being anti-foreign, being opposed to foreign ideas. I checked it out in this 1930s dictionary, Matthews English-Chinese Dictionary, and at that time they've got here Pai Wai, anti-foreign, Pai Wai Yun Dong, anti-foreign movement, and Pai Wai Junia, anti-foreign policy. So it's something that had these kind of negative connotations. And it's interesting, though, that Phan Bội Châu used this term because the topic of, or the content of this chapter isn't really about anti-foreign ideas. It's about the act of fighting off invading foreigners like the Mongols. And so what's interesting about this is what it tells me is that this is one of the earliest attempts, if not the earliest attempt by a Vietnamese author to try to come up with a theme for Vietnamese history and to come up with a specific theme that Vietnamese history is all about fighting off foreign invaders. What's interesting about Phan Bội Châu, though, is that he didn't have access to the term that is very common today, Zhong Wai Sum. That term had not been coined yet. It didn't exist yet. So he had this idea and he had to come up with a term for it. And so he looked around and he used this term Bang Wai, which today is, or which at that time had a very different meaning. interesting, but it was clearly the only thing he could come across or come up with that fit more, to some extent, what he was trying to look at. Another thing that's interesting in here is the one that I just lost my great note here for, but he's got another section here where he talks about the efforts or the hardships in the past that various Vietnamese courts have had with dealing with the Cham, and also, here we go, with dealing with the various savages. So he uses this term, man, that's in there. See if I can do it without I can't do this backwards. There we go. Man, the various man, and meaning the people in the mountains who were different from the Vietnamese. Also really interesting to see a kind of darker side to these ideas of fighting that Phan Bội Châu was trying to look at. Yes, there's a history of resisting, but also fighting these bad people who are in the realm or on the borders of it, who are causing trouble as well. So that's all really interesting to see how he was trying to come up with these kind of new ways of looking at Vietnamese history. And when I read stuff like this, it gets me so excited to see how modern ideas started to develop, which also gets me so angry when I find that when people translate stuff like this, they don't translate it faithfully according to what Phan Bội Châu actually wrote. So this is how the section on buying why, on sort of rejecting things, the foreigners, was translated into Vietnamese. They used the word Jong Wai Sum, which is this term that is used today. And if you're a modern reader and you pick up this book and you read the translation, you go, oh, look at that. Phan Bội Châu also talked about the phenomena of Jong Wai Sum, or resisting foreign invasion. No, he didn't also talk about this. He invented, or was one of the people who contributed towards inventing this idea. And he didn't have it completely formulated in his head yet. He didn't have a term like Jong Wai Sum that he was using yet. He had to use something that didn't quite fit and that has subsequently been abandoned. People don't use that term. And in talking about those savages, this is how the translator translated it, which also gets me very, very angry. There is no word for savage there. Instead, what we just have is the mountainous border regions. Các miền núi, núi biển dưới. That is not savage. And so it would be as if someone writing about American history today wrote about some book that was written in the 19th century, and instead of using the negative term by our standards today that were used to refer to black people, they would use a polite term that we have today, African American. That term was not used in the 19th century. Savage, and in the case of Vietnam, savage was used by Phan Bội Châu, but it's not in this modern book. And that is something that I find happening over and over with translations, which is really, really terrible, because it makes it impossible for people today to see the nuances in the historical record and to understand how ideas have developed over time. And it makes me particularly frustrated when the translator who wrote this says that bản dịch này chúng tôi cố gắng dịch sát nguyên văn, không thêm bất cứ một nội dung ý nghĩa nào trong đường câu đường đoạn. That is not true. When you put in terms like Jong Wai Sum and you omit terms like savage, you are completely changing the historical record. So this book, the Vietnam quốc kháo by Phan Bội Châu, is a very cool book. The translation, not cool, not cool. Stop doing this, guys. You're messing everything up. But this book by this guy is something have I really never read this before? That I definitely got to look more at. This is cool, cool stuff. Whew. Shun. SH. Revolution. Yeah, right? It's gotta be revolutionary. How much was a revolutionary?